They smiled at me like nothing was wrong, as if they hadn't just planned the cruelest joke behind my back. That envelope, that beautiful invitation was a lie, a setup, a trap, and I walked into it with my head high and my heart open. But they didn't know one thing. I had a secret too, one that would turn their picture-perfect event into the scandal of the year. And when it was over, they'd wish they had never played with me. The day the envelope arrived, it felt like the air shifted. A pale ivory square, thick and luxurious to the touch, adorned with golden lettering and sealed with a wax insignia she recognized immediately, her in-laws' family crest. For a moment, her fingers trembled as she held it. The very people who had barely masked their disdain for her, who had always found ways to remind her she didn't quite fit into their polished, tight-knit circle, had sent her a wedding invitation. Her first instinct was to question it. But curiosity quickly dissolved into cautious hope, and hope, however fragile, took over. She hadn't spoken to them in months, not since the last tense family dinner when her presence had been acknowledged only through passive glances and stiff nods. And now, suddenly, this invitation. She studied the card inside with disbelief and wonder. The wedding of her husband's cousin, someone she had met only once and briefly, was being held at a prestigious venue outside the city, a place she had seen only in magazines and bridal dream boards. It seemed surreal. The invitation wasn't just addressed to her husband. Her name was written as well, perfectly spelled, with elegant loops and flourishes. There was no denying it. They had thought of her, included her, wanted her there. And so, for the first time in a long while, she felt a soft light flicker within her. The possibility of belonging, of being seen as more than an outsider. Maybe things were changing. Maybe this was their way of extending an olive branch, of making peace after months of tension. She didn't dare voice these thoughts aloud, afraid they might dissolve in the air. But she let herself believe, just enough to start planning. The next few days moved like a quiet storm of excitement and nerves. She scrolled through websites searching for the right dress. Not too bold, not too plain. Elegant, but not attention-seeking. She imagined what the other guests might wear, what her mother-in-law might think if she wore something too vibrant. After hours of browsing and indecision, she finally settled on a soft sapphire gown that shimmered gently under the light, dignified, graceful, and safe. She went shopping for a gift, choosing a hand-painted porcelain set imported from Europe. It was expensive, more than she had intended to spend, but she wanted it to be perfect. She had it wrapped at the boutique with crisp silver paper and a cream ribbon, picturing it placed neatly on the wedding gift table, surrounded by admiration. Maybe it would even spark a conversation with someone at the event, maybe even a smile from her in-laws. In the days leading up to the wedding, she focused on the details. She booked a hair appointment, had her nails done, even practiced a few smiles in the mirror, reminding herself how to look poised without looking stiff. Underneath it all was a quiet, pulsing anxiety she tried to ignore. A whisper reminding her of every past moment she had felt small, invisible, or mocked behind polite smiles. But she pushed it away. This time would be different. The morning of the wedding was bright. The sky washed in a soft hue that made everything seem more vivid. She woke early, showered, styled her hair in soft waves, and took her time with makeup. Her reflection stared back at her with cautious optimism. This was her chance to be more than tolerated. This was her chance to be accepted. She left early, wanting to arrive ahead of time. The drive to the venue was long but beautiful, winding through tree-lined roads that opened up to a sprawling estate framed by white roses and meticulously trimmed hedges. Her heart pounded as she turned into the entrance, where valets guided cars into place and staff in black and white uniforms welcomed guests with soft smiles. Everything looked like a dream. For a moment, she was lost in it. She stepped out of the car, gift in hand, clutching her small clutch purse, and walked toward the main entrance. The building towered above her, all white stone and arched windows, draped in tulle and ivy. Music drifted from within. Laughter. Champagne flutes clinking. People mingling on the steps, posing for pictures in formal wear. She straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and approached the check-in table at the front. It was here, at this exact point, that something in her chest began to shift. She smiled politely, gave her name, and waited. The woman behind the table flipped through a long list, then again slower. Her polite smile began to strain at the edges. She asked for the name again. Then a third time. A second person came over. Whispers followed. Her smile faltered. They asked if she was certain she had been invited. She held up the invitation, now creased from the tight grip she had on it. The staff exchanged glances. Her stomach tightened. Suddenly, the surrounding laughter sounded distant and sharp. She felt eyes on her. Someone nearby stifled a laugh. Her fingers gripped the invitation tighter as her breath caught in her throat. They told her as gently as possible that she wasn't on the list, that there must have been some mistake. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding. They asked if she could wait off to the side while they figured it out. She stepped aside, but her legs felt heavy. The air felt too warm. From a distance, she watched familiar faces glance her way, and then quickly turn. She recognized the bride's sister. She saw her husband's aunt. She waved, unsure, but they looked through her as if she were invisible. The tightness in her chest bloomed into something unbearable. Minutes passed. No one returned to help her. The line at the check-in desk grew. People were being escorted inside. She stood alone, her heels pressing painfully into the stone walkway. Her gift now a weight she wished she could throw away. The soft flicker of hope she had nurtured all week began to dim. Every detail she had planned, the dress, the hair, the gift, all of it suddenly felt foolish. She realized with agonizing clarity that something was very, very wrong. And somewhere deep inside, in the quiet space beneath the humiliation and confusion, a new feeling began to stir. It was cold, slow-burning, and sharp around the edges. It was the beginning of something else entirely. She stood there longer than she could measure, her fingers clutching the smooth ribbon of the gift box, her pulse echoing louder than the music drifting from inside the venue. The sun no longer felt warm against her skin. It seemed to press down on her, heavy and sharp. People kept arriving, gliding past her like she didn't exist, like she wasn't standing there in full view, overdressed and overlooked. Their gazes barely paused on her, and if they did, it was only long enough to flicker with recognition, confusion, or worse, amusement. Her throat burned with the effort to maintain composure, to smile as if everything was fine, as if she wasn't being swallowed whole by a creeping awareness that this might not be a mistake at all. Eventually, no one returned to check on her. The woman at the front desk had been replaced with a younger girl who looked through her like she was just part of the decor, part of the scenery. The security guard shifted but didn't approach. The longer she stood there, the more invisible she felt. And yet paradoxically, the more exposed she became. It was as if she had been placed under a spotlight, only for everyone to pretend the light wasn't there. After what felt like hours but must have only been minutes, she made the choice to walk forward, each step echoing with both defiance and desperation. Her heels clicked against the marble floors as she entered the venue, her gift still held like a shield. She moved through the entryway slowly, eyes scanning the lavish interior. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, floral arrangements taller than her framed every doorway, and soft classical music floated through the air. Waiters in black vests offered drinks on silver trays. The guests moved in little clusters, laughing and chatting, posing for photos near a floral arch. No one approached her. No one welcomed her. She saw a few familiar faces, relatives from her husband's side, and tried to meet their gaze. They looked at her with the kind of curiosity one might give to a person who didn't belong. A few smiled thinly, but their eyes betrayed something colder. Some turned away too quickly. Some whispered to others. A few chuckled, not even bothering to hide it. The realization settled over her like frost. Not only had they not expected her, they had expected her not to come. Or worse, they had counted on her walking in blind. She continued into the reception area, feeling the stairs crawl over her like insects. The grand ballroom was already half filled with guests sipping champagne, mingling around tall candlelit tables. The seating chart stood elegantly near the door, names printed in golden cursive. She approached it with trembling hands, her heart pounding against her ribs. She scanned the rows slowly, carefully. Her name wasn't there. Not under her husband's last name, not under her maiden name, not anywhere. She searched again, slower, hoping she'd missed something. But her name was gone. Absent. Deleted. She turned and looked around the room, searching for something familiar, something safe. There was no sign of her husband. He hadn't come with her that day, caught up in a work trip he couldn't reschedule. They had agreed it would be fine for her to attend alone, especially since the invitation had included her name. She had wanted to show them that she could hold her own, that she wasn't just the quiet girl from the outside, marrying into money and privilege. She had wanted to stand tall on her own merit. But now, standing here amid strangers and soft, venomous whispers, she felt like she was drowning in silence. The seats were already half-filled. Elegant place cards stood at each plate. As she walked along the tables, searching for her name, she began to notice how deliberately absent it was. There were no unmarked seats. No extras. Every single seat had a name, a cousin, a friend, a family member. People who belonged. She walked down another row. Still nothing. Her steps slowed. Her palms sweated against the wrapping paper of the gift she was still holding. Some guests had started to watch her more openly now. A few leaned into their neighbors, murmuring behind manicured hands. She felt their eyes on her back like heat. Every movement she made, every slight turn of her head, was dissected in silence. Their smiles were brittle. Their laughter, when it came, had an unmistakable edge. At one table near the center, she spotted her mother-in-law. She looked poised and immaculate as always, her hair in a smooth chignon, pearls resting against her neck like they were born there. She glanced in her direction once, but there was no welcome in her face. No surprise. No kindness. Just that same impenetrable mask of cool detachment that had followed her since the beginning. Her father-in-law sat beside her, sipping wine unmoved. A few other relatives sat around them, some nudging one another discreetly. At that moment, it was clear. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a misname or a clerical error. It wasn't even a misunderstanding. It was intentional. The invitation had been sent to her on purpose, not as a gesture of peace or reconciliation, but as a trap, a performance, a joke. They had sent her the invite knowing she'd show up. They had counted on it. Counted on her walking into their world unarmed and unaware. Counted on her standing alone among them, stunned, grasping for some explanation. It wasn't just cruelty. It was artful humiliation, crafted with precision. And as the realization rooted deeper into her, a hollow silence filled her chest. She turned toward the nearest exit, her face blank, her body moving without thought. The gift in her hand felt like an anchor now. She found a side hallway that led toward the restrooms and disappeared into it. Away from the music, away from the glittering crowd. Her reflection in the mirror looked foreign. Eyes wide and glassy. Lips tight, skin pale beneath the makeup. She placed the gift on the marble countertop and stepped back from it like it was something toxic. It didn't belong in her hands anymore. None of it did. Her breathing came shallow as she leaned against the wall, feeling the cold tile against her back. The silence of the hallway was oppressive. Her phone buzzed in her purse, but she didn't move to check it. There was nothing anyone could say to undo what had been done. She was already too deep in it. Somewhere beyond the thick walls, applause erupted. Maybe the ceremony had begun. Maybe it had ended. She didn't care. Time had splintered into before and after. And in this new after, the version of herself that had believed in redemption, in reconciliation, in family, she no longer existed. The humiliation was complete. The plan had worked. They had broken her publicly, without raising their voices, without lifting a finger. And she had walked straight into it. But something inside her hadn't shattered. Not quite. Beneath the layers of disbelief, sorrow, and shame, something small and sharp took shape. Not hope. Not yet. but something colder. Something stronger. Not everyone who gets pushed down stays there. Some fall quietly. Others rise. And though she didn't know it yet, this was the moment her revenge began. She remained in the hallway for longer than she intended, motionless, suspended in the kind of numbness that made everything around her feel distant and unreal. The sounds of the wedding, the clinking of glasses, the soft music, the rising bursts of laughter, were muffled through the thick walls. Yet each note seemed to mock her. The porcelain gift box sat abandoned on the marble counter, a symbol of her naivety. Its silver ribbon still held its perfect shape, untouched by the chaos unfolding inside her. Her mind looped through fragments of the past few days, trying to make sense of the cruelty that had just unraveled. Every detail she had obsessed over. The dress, the wrapping paper, the carefully chosen shoes. All of it felt like a costume in a staged humiliation she hadn't known she was part of until the final act. Time became slippery. Minutes bled into one another as she stared at her own reflection, searching for any trace of stability. Her lipstick had begun to smudge. Her eyes were rimmed red, and her expression held that familiar look of someone trying not to fall apart in public. It was a look she had seen before, on herself, at family dinners where polite insults had been served alongside dessert, at holiday gatherings where she had been introduced as the one he married instead of by her name. And yet, even through those moments, she had always held on to a thread of hope that things would change. That maybe one day, her place would be real. That thread had now snapped clean. A sound behind her made her turn slightly. Heels clicking on the tile. Voices drawing nearer. She froze, then stepped quickly into the nearest restroom stall, closing the door behind her with shaking fingers. Through the thin gap above the floor, she saw two pairs of feet stop in front of the mirror. Two women, well-dressed, tipsy, whispering with the looseness that champagne always brought. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't need to. As far as they were concerned, the hallway had been empty. The words spilled out carelessly. Laughter coated every sentence. They spoke of the girl who had shown up with a gift. The one who wasn't on the list. The one who thought she had been invited. They said her name. Said it with a cruel softness, like a joke that didn't need to be told all the way through. One of them mentioned the mother-in-law. How clever she was to think of it. How brilliant the execution had been. The fake invitation. The dress. The perfect timing. She stood frozen in the stall. Hands clenched so tightly her nails dug crescents into her palms. The weight of each word landed like a stone in her stomach. There was no more room for doubt. This had been planned. They had wanted her to show up. Not just as an oversight, not just to exclude her. They wanted her to come. Wanted her to be seen. Wanted her to be humiliated in the softest, most elegant way possible. In front of their friends, their family, their polished, smirking audience. The cruelest part of all was how quiet the humiliation had been. No scenes. No yelling. Just subtle looks, cold shoulders, and a carefully crafted silence that made her feel foolish for even asking why. The two women laughed again, their voices fading as they left the bathroom. She didn't move. She stood in that stall with her back against the wall, her body trembling, her thoughts spinning out into a darkness she hadn't felt before. Something inside her had fractured. Not a break that left you helpless, but a split that revealed another layer. Something hard and quiet that had been buried beneath years of trying too hard, apologizing too often, and shrinking herself to fit spaces that were never made for her. She finally stepped out into the hallway again, her legs unsteady. The laughter from the ballroom still spilled outward, but now it sounded different. Sharper. She didn't return to the main hall. Instead, she walked down the corridor in the opposite direction, not entirely sure where she was going, but needing to move. Her mind had gone from silence to noise. Thoughts tumbled one over the other, each more bitter than the last. How long had they planned this? Who else knew? Was her husband aware? Had he been part of it, or had he been left in the dark just like her? The possibility that he might have known, or worse, approved, scratched at her like thorns. She had defended him before, excused his silence, told herself that his loyalty was split, that navigating family dynamics wasn't easy. But now, the absence of his support felt glaring. He hadn't checked in that day, hadn't called, hadn't even sent a message to ask how it was going. And she realized, with a slow, sinking certainty, that he might have known this was coming and had chosen not to be there. The realization made her stop walking. It was more than humiliation now. It was betrayal, layered and deep, the kind that doesn't scream but whispers itself into your bones. She had tried to belong, tried to earn her place. And all along, they had been waiting for a moment like this to remind her that she never had won. They didn't see her as family. They never had. She was a placeholder, a name on paper, an inconvenient truth they covered with smiles and then mocked when her back was turned. She turned and walked back toward the entrance, each step now sharper, more purposeful. She picked up the gift from the counter without looking at it and exited the hallway. Her heels echoed with finality as she moved through the corridors, ignoring the faces that turned to glance at her one last time. She didn't care how they looked at her now. She didn't care if they whispered or smirked. Something had shifted in her. A door had closed. Not the one they thought they'd slammed in her face. That one had been closed long ago. No, this was another door. The one that led back to the version of herself that waited to be accepted, waited to be loved, waited to be treated as an equal. That version no longer existed. Outside, the air was cooler. The wind brushed against her face like a wake-up call. The parking lot shimmered with cars under the golden light of late afternoon. She reached her car, unlocked it with stiff fingers, and slid into the driver's seat. Her hands stayed on the steering wheel for a long moment. She stared through the windshield at nothing. Everything inside her was still, not calm, but clear. There was no sobbing. No breakdown. The tears had dried before they even had a chance to fall. She placed the gift box gently on the passenger seat, then reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered for a second before she unlocked it and scrolled through her contacts. She didn't hesitate. She tapped a name and raised the phone to her ear. It rang twice before the voice on the other end answered. She didn't offer a greeting. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady. Her words were simple. She said she needed help, that she was ready. The person on the other end didn't question her. They just said they would handle it. And that was all she needed to hear. She ended the call, dropped the phone into her lap, and leaned back in the seat. For the first time that day, she felt something that wasn't sadness. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something colder, more measured. The humiliation she had endured wouldn't vanish, but it would no longer control her. They had planned the perfect scene, played their parts with precision, but they had made one fatal mistake. They believed she would go home and disappear quietly, that she would shrink back into her silence, that she would carry this shame alone, without a response. But they were wrong. And soon, they would find out just how wrong they had been. The drive home was quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't soothe but sharpened. With every mile that passed, she found herself peeling away from the person she had been just hours before. The woman who had chosen a sapphire dress with hope in her heart, who had spent hours wrapping a gift with perfect corners and silk ribbon, who had arrived at the wedding venue believing maybe, just maybe, this was the turning point. That woman had been discarded in the restroom stall with smudged makeup and trembling hands. What emerged from that silence on the highway was someone else entirely. Someone who had stopped waiting for apologies. Someone who had opened her eyes. She arrived home to an empty apartment. The silence there didn't mock her. It gave her space. Her husband wouldn't return until the next day. He hadn't called since the ceremony, hadn't sent a message, hadn't asked how it went. And she no longer needed him to. Whatever answer he had would either make things worse or confirm what she had already begun to suspect. His absence had been too convenient, too well-timed. She no longer believed in coincidences. She placed the untouched gift on the kitchen counter, then walked into the bedroom and began to undress. The gown slid off her shoulders like regret, pooling on the floor in a shimmer of wasted effort. She stood before the mirror for a long time, Not to admire or criticize, but to study. Her eyes were tired, but there was a new sharpness to them. She looked like someone who had burned through the last of her illusions. There was nothing left in her to convince, to win over, to soften. She changed into something comfortable and tied her hair back. Then she sat at the small desk in the corner of the room, opened her laptop, and began the quiet work of preparation. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then faster, more deliberate. She began by pulling up social media accounts, wedding photos, recent posts from her in-laws and their extended circle. She made note of names, relationships, locations, details. She mapped the network in silence. Every person connected to the event, every post they made, every tag, every comment, was a thread. And she began to weave. Then she opened an old folder she had kept buried deep in her inbox. Emails, screenshots, small things she had saved over the years without knowing why. Petty comments made in group chats. Passive-aggressive remarks disguised as jokes. An accidental forwarded message from her sister-in-law years ago where her name had been mentioned in less than flattering terms. At the time, she had ignored them, choosing to take the higher road, hoping things would improve with patience. But now, those fragments formed the beginning of something clearer. She began to write. Not emotionally, but with precision. She crafted a timeline, moments where things had crossed the line from difficult to damaging. Not just to her pride, but to her identity. She recalled moments when decisions had been made without her input, when events had been planned around her exclusion, when she had been spoken about as though she were a burden her husband had chosen to bear. The memories that had once brought only confusion now returned with crystal clarity. She remembered a family brunch when her mother-in-law had joked about people who marry up, and how everyone had laughed. She remembered the time her father-in-law had mentioned his disappointment that his son hadn't married someone from their world. She recalled birthday parties where her seat had been an afterthought, and holidays where her dishes were left untouched on the table, while others were praised. None of it had been loud. That was their genius. Their cruelty came in whispers, in absence, in microcosms of exclusion that, when strung together, formed a complete portrait of rejection. But rejection alone wasn't enough to ignite what she now felt. It was the laughter in that hallway, the gleeful satisfaction in their voices. That was the spark. The confirmation that this hadn't been social awkwardness or miscommunication. It had been orchestrated, and it deserved consequences. She made a list. At the top were names, those who had been involved, those who had laughed, those who had stood by. Then came affiliations, businesses, organizations, charities her in-laws donated to, names they cared about, reputations they protected. Then came the secrets. She knew things. Not scandalous, explosive things, but carefully hidden blemishes in their polished world. The business deal her father-in-law had tried to keep quiet when it nearly cost him his reputation. The affair her sister-in-law had years ago that no one in the family ever spoke about. The time a charity donation was inflated on paper for clout. She had never cared enough to weaponize those things before. They had never been relevant. But now they were tools. Still, she wasn't interested in destruction for destruction's sake. That wasn't the plan. Her revenge wouldn't come in the form of public collapse or messy confrontation. It would come in the form of exposure, one calculated move at a time. They had used her silence against her. Now she would use their secrets against them. Not loudly, not cruelly, strategically, just enough to peel back the mask they wore and show the world what truly lay beneath it. She began reaching out to people, carefully, anonymously at times. Journalists she knew from old connections. A blogger who specialized in social scandals among the elite. An influencer who had once been snubbed by her sister-in-law at a gala and had never forgotten it. She fed them breadcrumbs, nothing direct, just enough to ignite curiosity. She crafted emails under a pseudonym, sent tip-offs that linked small truths with public records. No lies, just exposure. The truth, when delivered in the right way, was often more devastating than fiction. And she understood their world well enough to know which truths would bruise their image the deepest. Over the next several days, while the family celebrated their wedding success online, posting photos, videos, filtered memories of a flawless day, she worked quietly behind the scenes. She watched their likes climb, their comments flood with praise, and smiled not with bitterness but with understanding. They believed the performance had ended, that the curtain had fallen with her humiliation as its final scene. But the play wasn't over. Each time a new photo appeared, each time a caption bragged about unity and love, she prepared the next step. Her goal wasn't to destroy, it was to reframe, to make the world see them as she had finally seen them, as manipulators of image, masters of exclusion, people so obsessed with appearances that they were willing to orchestrate cruelty for entertainment. She wasn't rushing. Revenge, she knew now, wasn't about speed. It was about precision. She wanted them to feel it slowly, the way she had. Not in a flash of anger, but in the drawn-out sting of knowing something was slipping beyond their control. Their narrative, their image, their reputation. And through it all, she remained quiet. She didn't post. She didn't call. She didn't warn them. Her silence was the echo of their own cruelty, returned to them in the form of strategy. She had learned from them, learned how to make people feel small with a smile, how to erase someone without ever raising her voice. They had taught her the art of subtle destruction. Now she was the student surpassing the masters. The day of the gala had arrived, and the air buzzed with excitement and self-importance. It was the kind of event that everyone in their affluent circle either talked about or tried desperately to get into. The in-laws, known for their extravagant lifestyle and social climbing, were naturally at the center of it all. They spared no expense. The venue was a gleaming estate, complete with manicured gardens, a string quartet at the entrance, and valets dressed like they had stepped out of a luxury film set. It was a night for masks, mystery, and egos inflated to bursting. And among the guests, gliding like a shadow through the crowd, was someone they never saw coming. She had arrived early, blending seamlessly with the gathering attendees. Her identity cloaked beneath an intricately designed mask. Every detail of her attire had been chosen with care. An elegant gown that exuded sophistication, but gave no hint of its wearer's true nature. She didn't linger or pose for photos like the others. Instead, she moved quietly, observing, collecting glances, and making note of the social currents swirling around the family that had once humiliated her so publicly. Her presence was intentional and calculated. She wasn't there to merely witness. She had a role to play, one that would unwind slowly, deliciously, and with the precision of someone who had rehearsed each step in her mind 100 times. Her entrance didn't raise suspicion. After all, this was a masquerade, and the whole point was anonymity. What no one realized was that behind her mask wasn't just a guest, it was a reckoning. She kept to the edges at first, sipping champagne slowly, letting her ears catch snippets of gossip and shallow flattery that floated like perfume in the air. Her eyes stayed locked on the in-laws, watching them entertain their wealthy friends, preen for attention, and bask in their carefully curated social image. They laughed too loudly, smiled too broadly, but beneath it all, she saw the cracks, the performative nature of their joy, the desperation for admiration. The moment came when the crowd began to settle, gathering in the grand ballroom where the hosts would make their formal address. Lights dimmed, and spotlights warmed the stage where the in-laws, dressed in opulent attire, stood ready to receive praise and applause. It was during this pause, as silence gently fell over the space, that she made her move. She stepped forward, not toward the stage, but toward a gathering of important guests near the front. With practiced ease, she began casual conversations, slipping subtle but powerful truths into her words, planting seeds of curiosity and doubt. Her tone was gentle, her language veiled, but the implications were unmistakable. The people she spoke to were no strangers to whispers and innuendo. They lived for it. So when she mentioned a peculiar discrepancy about the in-laws' recent business venture, something she had dug up in her weeks of research, they leaned in. When she hinted at the family's less-than-savory past, eyebrows rose. She wasn't overt. That would have been clumsy. She was surgical. Her words wove into the narrative of the evening like silk threads tainted with poison. And as she glided away, her trail left behind confused murmurs and thoughtful frowns. By the time the hosts took the stage, a subtle tension had already begun to ripple through the audience. Laughter didn't come as freely. Polite applause seemed slower, less enthusiastic. She watched from a distance as the in-laws scanned the room with uneasy smiles, trying to decode the sudden shift in mood. Her heart beat steady, not with nerves but with the electric thrill of control. For once, she wasn't the one exposed. They were. The climax of the night was a charity auction, a grand gesture designed to showcase their wealth and generosity. It was during this spectacle that she delivered the second act of her plan. Anonymously, she bid a staggering amount on an unremarkable item, immediately capturing attention. Faces turned, wondering who could afford such extravagance. When the auctioneer asked for the name of the mysterious bidder, she simply shook her head and gave a small bow, letting the mask speak for her. Whispers swelled across the ballroom. Who was she? A dignitary? A secret heiress? The mystery of her identity ignited curiosity like wildfire. The in-laws stiffened, sensing a threat they couldn't name. After the auction, she disappeared into the garden for a moment, letting the anticipation and confusion build. She wanted them to feel it, the unease of not knowing who held the power in the room. When she returned, she deliberately crossed paths with key players, journalists, donors, old family acquaintances. With every interaction, she added fuel to the fire, small comments, raised eyebrows, strategic pauses. Each moment designed not to expose but to question, to make them wonder what they had missed, and who this woman might be. By the end of the evening, she had left an indelible mark on every conversation, every corner of the party. The in-laws were no longer confident. Their eyes flicked nervously from guest to guest, trying to locate the source of the growing discomfort. They hadn't yet identified her, but they felt her presence like a chill. They sensed that someone had slipped through their perfectly guarded evening and unraveled the thread they'd so carefully wrapped around their reputations. She didn't stay to witness the unraveling completely. Her exit was as graceful as her entrance. Quiet, unremarkable, untraceable. But as she walked out beneath the starlit sky, her pulse hummed with satisfaction. The plan was unfolding, and this was only the beginning. They had tried to erase her dignity with a fake invitation and cold stares. Now she was rewriting the story on her terms, mask by mask, lie by lie, truth by truth. And the best part? They still didn't know what was coming. The sun hovered high above the estate, casting golden flecks of light across the lush grounds where the ceremony was set to take place. Everything appeared immaculate. The white chairs arranged in perfect symmetry, the aisle strewn with delicate rose petals, and the floral arch standing tall as if daring the skies to challenge its beauty. Guests had begun to arrive, each one dressed in careful elegance, murmuring softly as they admired the venue, took their seats, and exchanged polite glances under the weight of anticipation. At the surface, the air was filled with celebration and charm. Yet beneath that luster, tension pulsed, heavy and unseen. Like a fault line beneath a pristine landscape, Caroline stood behind a curtain at the far end of the house, staring at her reflection one last time. Her dress clung to her perfectly, the silk hugging her frame like it was made for no one else. Her hair, pinned in an intricate braid, shimmered under the chandelier's light. She looked every part the bride she had always dreamed to be. But inside, her thoughts churned relentlessly. Despite the preparations, the applause, the orchestrated joy that surrounded her, something remained unsettled within her. She could feel the invisible thread pulling at the seams of the day, as though something crucial had been misplaced or intentionally hidden. The hush fell across the garden like a wave as the ceremony was about to begin. The music started, soft, graceful, laced with sentiment, and the guests rose from their seats in unison. The bridal procession began, and all eyes turned to the aisle. Caroline emerged from the manor like a vision, and for a moment, it seemed that time bowed to her presence. She walked slowly, steadily, her eyes locked on Michael, who stood at the altar waiting with a calm expression that bordered on unreadable. He offered a practiced smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and Caroline noted it. Still, she pushed forward, each step a prayer, each breath a thread of hope holding together the fragments of her trust. But it was not her entrance that would define the moment. It was the interruption. Unforeseen, unscripted, yet utterly inevitable. Just as the officiant welcomed everyone and began the formalities, the back of the gathering stirred. Chairs creaked. Heads turned. Whispers spilled like wine over a white tablecloth. A figure moved purposefully down the aisle, not in white, not in joy, but in the unmistakable command of someone with something to say. The woman's presence struck the crowd like lightning. Dressed in a simple but bold black dress, she walked slowly, heels pressing into the grass with defiant rhythm. Her eyes were fixed on the couple standing beneath the arch. Her face was calm, too calm, betraying none of the emotional chaos her presence ignited among the guests. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. Michael paled. The officiant hesitated, fumbling with the script. No one moved. It was as if time itself paused, unsure of what was about to unfold. The woman reached the front and stopped just before the first row. Without being invited, without asking permission, she spoke. Her voice, clear and cold, cut through the silence like glass. Words poured out, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. They were facts. Dates. Names. Receipts. Locations. Things Caroline hadn't heard. Things she had suspected. Things she had feared but buried beneath rituals and optimism. The guests sat frozen, their collective breath held hostage by the unraveling of what had been promised as a sacred moment. Michael tried to speak. He tried to object, to redirect, to suggest misunderstandings and convenient timelines. But each defense he raised was met with irrefutable proof, carefully timed and delivered with surgical precision. This wasn't a random act of jealousy or vengeance. It was a premeditated release of truth, calibrated to implode the foundation of trust he had tried to rebuild. His voice, which had once charmed crowds, now trembled under the weight of exposure. Caroline didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't storm off. She simply stood, her hands clenched around the bouquet as her knuckles whitened. Her heart thundered against her ribs, not from betrayal. She had already grieved the betrayal long before, but from the public spectacle of it all. Her humiliation was now communal. Her private doubts now public knowledge. There was no room left for pretending. No veil thick enough to shield her from what had been laid bare. The guests began murmuring again, this time less like observers of a ceremony and more like witnesses at a trial. The whispers coalesced into gasps, into glances, into judgments and shifting allegiances. Some stood and left, unable to bear the discomfort. Others stayed, compelled by the gravity of the moment. The wedding, once a carefully orchestrated performance, had become something else entirely, an exorcism of secrets, a reckoning that couldn't be postponed. As the woman turned and walked back down the aisle, the hush remained. No one clapped. No one smiled. The music had long stopped, and in its absence, only the occasional breeze moved, fluttering petals like discarded remnants of something once beautiful. Caroline looked at Michael, really looked, and saw not a groom, not even a liar, but a stranger. A man who had lived a parallel life beside her own. She took one step back, then another, until she turned and walked away, bouquet still in hand, but no longer symbolic of love or future. It was just a prop now, one she intended to discard. Behind her, the guests slowly rose, uncertain what to do in the aftermath of shattered vows and silenced traditions. The officiant closed the book without finishing the ceremony. The altar stood empty. The chairs began to empty as well, the crowd dispersing like fog under a rising sun. The day was still bright, the air still warm, but the celebration was over. The truth had arrived, uninvited but absolute, and nothing that followed would be able to pretend it hadn't. She walked slowly, deliberately, the echo of her heels against the marble floor ringing louder than any voice in the room. Each step seemed to weigh more than the last, not because of pain or sorrow, but because of the strength it took to hold her spine straight after the storm. Eyes were on her, wide, stunned, ashamed, curious. But she didn't lower her gaze. Not once. The shame that had once clung to her like smoke had dissipated, burned away by the fire of truth she had unleashed. What remained was not weakness, but a quiet, smoldering power that neither apology nor denial could touch. In that moment, she realized there was nothing left to prove. The ceremony, the guests, the gowns, the chandeliers, all of it had lost its meaning. It had once been a stage set to celebrate a life built on illusions. Now it was just rubble behind her. She had not come to plead. She had come to confront, to expose, to reclaim herself. And she had done it. Her heart didn't race anymore. It beat steady, anchored by a new kind of certainty. The lies, the betrayal, the isolation she had endured, they were no longer weights around her ankles. They were stepping stones behind her. Each one had taught her how far people could fall and how strong she could rise. There was no longer a reason to beg for closure. She had created her own. The silence around her wasn't empty. It was charged. People didn't speak because they didn't know what to say. Some lowered their heads in guilt. Others stared, transfixed by her composure. They had watched her break before. Now they watched her walk away unbroken. They saw something unfamiliar. Dignity in defiance, grace in destruction. She didn't pause at the threshold. The doors didn't creak. They opened with ease, almost as if they, too, recognized her decision. The world outside was darker than inside, but it was hers again. No longer a place to run from, but a place she could rebuild in. The night air was cool, brushing against her cheeks like a silent whisper of freedom. For the first time in months, she could breathe. The streets were still. No chairs, no chaos. Just the soft hum of the city going on with its life, unaware of the war she had just won. But she didn't need witnesses. She didn't need applause. The applause had always been a mask for other people's comfort. What she needed now was clarity, and it unfolded with every step she took away from that gilded hall. The dress she wore, once chosen to impress, to blend in, to play the part, now felt like armor she no longer needed. It had served its purpose, helped her walk through fire without showing the burns. But as she moved further from the building, she felt the weight of it lessen, not physically, but emotionally. It had been stitched from expectation. Now it was just fabric. She kept walking, past rows of cars, past curious onlookers who had stepped out to see what the commotion was, past people who whispered to each other but never to her. Let them wonder. Let them fill the blanks with their own versions. The truth was hers alone, and that was enough. She didn't have a destination. Not yet. But she knew she couldn't return to where she had been. Not to the house, not to the people, not to the silence that had caged her. She would find a new beginning, somewhere untouched by betrayal. Maybe it would be small, maybe it would be uncertain, but it would be hers. That alone made it sacred. Memories surfaced now and then, but they no longer held her hostage. They were reminders of a version of herself that had been too forgiving, too afraid, too invested in saving others while losing herself. That version was gone. In its place stood someone forged by pain and sharpened by clarity. She remembered the faces, smiling on the surface, hiding knives beneath their tongues. She remembered the whispers that turned to accusations, the celebrations that ended in isolation, the embraces that concealed betrayal. But she didn't carry those faces with her anymore. She left them behind in the hall of shattered illusions. A cab slowed beside her, its headlights briefly washing over her like stage lights. The driver leaned out, asked if she needed a ride. She shook her head gently. She needed to walk a little longer, to feel the ground beneath her feet, to honor the journey she had taken and the strength it had demanded. This walk wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It was her crossing over from a life dictated by others to one sculpted by her own hands. Eventually, the sounds of the city embraced her. The rumble of distant traffic, the flutter of wind through leaves, the faint music spilling from open windows. They reminded her that life hadn't stopped while she was fighting her private battles. It had gone on, indifferent and vast. And now she was finally ready to meet it on her own terms. She reached the end of the block, paused beneath a flickering street lamp, and looked back once. Not in longing, not in regret, but in acknowledgement. That place behind her had been a battlefield. She had lost parts of herself there. But she had also won something far greater, sovereignty. And that kind of victory didn't need confetti. It just needed a clean break. She turned forward again and kept walking. Into the unknown, yes, but not as a victim, not as someone broken. She walked like someone who had been burned and healed, cut and closed, betrayed and awakened. She walked like someone who knew who she was now, and that knowledge, fierce and unshakable, would be her compass from here on.